Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Arab Identity, episode number 12, presented to you by the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts. I have the pleasure today of having with me in the studio Dr. Adnan Jaber, PhD in clinical psychology. Welcome, Dr. Adnan.
Thank you, Wissam.
Today's topic is psychological foundations of identity, identity crisis and diffusion, challenges facing Arab identity. Sometimes when we talk about identity, we have been talking about history, we have been talking about some literary narratives, we have been talking about geopolitical perspectives, but there is also a psychological perspective for identity. Today, we are going to explore that with one of the experts on the subject, Dr. Adnan Jaber. Dr. Adnan Jaber, the larger title of this episode is the psychological foundations of identity. Let's talk about the layers of identity before we dwell into the challenges facing, as an example, an Arab with forming his or her identity.
First, I would like to say hi to you and to your audience, Wissam, and thank you for hosting, I think, this important topic. First of all, let me say that everyone, throughout his or her life has to deal with the issue of identity. Whatever your affiliation is, you have to deal with the questions of who you are, who am I, how do I relate to people, what defines me as a person, what are my attributes, what are my belongings, and what are my, what makes me a person, what makes me who I am, or who am I, I'm sorry. So anyone will have to deal and resolve this issue in their own way. We will talk about later about the challenges specific to one aspect of our identity, which is the Arab identity. But identity is a big umbrella. Identity is a very, I would say, a broad term that includes within it aspects of our personal identity, aspects of who we are as individuals, aspects of our own experiences, and also part of this identity is a social identity, which is a group identity, as you all know, or as you know. So psychologists have talked about identity for hundreds of years, maybe since the beginning of psychology, and we have been talking about how do we form an identity? What is it to have an identity? I'm not going to talk about philosophical aspects about identity, but basically, from a philosophical perspective, just a little bit of an introduction, identity relates to something that is constant and the same, right? You know, that's what distinguishes identity from other terms, is that it's constant and it's the same. So you sleep, you wake up, you're still Wissam. I sleep, I wake up, I'm still Adnan. I think there is a lot of questions that people philosophically speaking say, well, is that the same person? But psychologically speaking, this identity is what holds you, what keeps you. If you every day you have to reinvent yourself, if you don't have continuity within yourself, then there is a lot of problems that can happen because of that. As a species, we need this narrative, which is identity. We need this center of gravity. Danielle Dennett called it a narrative fiction, which is helpful. We need this narrative about ourselves. We need this continuity and sameness. So when we talk about identity, we talk about many terms, but let me simplify this and talk about self-concept. You cannot talk about identity before you talk about self-concept. Basically, it's divided into parts, the self and the concept. You will have a sense of yourself even at 3 or 4 months, and that has to relate to what's inside of you, what's outside of you. I mean, infants as young as 3 or 4 months know what's outside of their body and what's inside of them. And if you want to think about this, you're talking about survival mechanism. Bacteria know that, viruses know that. There's an environment outside of them, and there is an environment inside of them. What's outside is not them, what's inside is them. So you learn to have an existential sense of a separate and distinct self. As you grow older, especially in adolescence, you begin to witness changes in your body as an adolescent. Puberty hits, a lot of roles start to change. What was once a parent's influence is now kind of like going into the background, and instead of it, there is an influence from school, from friends, from your own relationship outside of home. You start the process of categorizing, or what we say, categorical self. There are categories to yourself. Who are you? One of these categories, and the basic ones, is especially with kids. I'm a boy, I'm a girl, I'm 3, I'm 4, right? If you ask a 3 or 4-year-old, tell me about yourself, the first thing that would come to their mind is that I'm a boy, I'm a girl, I am whatever, I'm 3 or 4. As you grow older, those categories become more complex. You start to think about yourself in terms that are very psychological, and in terms that are more complex, right? I am honest. I am outgoing. I like to do this or that. And as you are building all of these attributes and these categories, they go into your sense of who you are. A lot of this, is happening unconsciously. As you grow up, you gather a lot of experiences. These experiences are the core of yourself. And usually, most of the time, you're not aware of them until someone asks you about them. But they are just ready for you to access them. Like, oh, I am this and this and this. So self-concept leads to the personal identity, because without identity, you cannot be able to think about yourself, perceive, and interpret things. You need something that allows you to deal with the world, and this is the nature of self and identity. So from a basic perspective, a self is a needed psychological construct that allows us to have a sense of continuity, a sense of sameness from day to day, and allows us to interact with the world. That's basically in a nutshell.
Have you just said that self is a psychological construct?
That's again, well, I don't want to dwell in that on that. I'm sorry, but there a lot of things. Like if you look at the brain, there is no self. Like there's no center that's the self. So basically, a lot of what we call the self is different attributes of our minds and brains that they come together to us. I told you earlier, Daniel Dennett, one of the best philosophers of the 20th century, about the mind, and he called the self a fictitious construct, but yet a very survival-based construct. It allows us to make sense of our world. It allows us to interact with the world. From that perspective, yes, it's a construct. Because there is no one area in your brain that is yourself. We know now that the brain and the mind are the same. There's no separate self from you as a Wissam. You are all one. But somehow, language and our brain allows us to construct this sense of a self because it's very adaptive. Without it, we would not be able to interact and survive and achieve our goals.
Now, what is the role of group identity moving from there on the formation or the evolution of self-identity?
Yeah, as I said, one of the things that human beings, and maybe other species, but let me talk about human beings, are good at is categorization. And it's just like looking at our world and deciding what's in and what's out.
Drawing patterns and
relationships, but mainly patterns, right? And one of the things people gradually do is that they classify things, right? So usually at an early age you classify things based on the way you look. Like I give you an example. So one classification we use, for children, they know doggy. Most children like a doggy, right? And then every other animal they see at the beginning that has four arms and legs and fur, they call them a doggy, because they classify everything under this umbrella. We do that, and the more we categorize, we start creating groups, looking at groups outside. We know males, females. Now we have many different aspects of this identity, but we categorize things. And that's what we do as human beings. And it's an adaptive thing. We cannot deal with the world without this categorization. It simplifies things for us. Sometimes it's not completely accurate, but without, we cannot actually deal. We need to categorize the world. So the first aspect of a group identity is categorization. What is, who's who and why, who belong where and why, where do I belong? The second aspect of an identity after you categorize is you start identifying with it. How do you identify with something? It's just sometimes you identify with a group based on a choice, right? You become an engineer and you start identifying with the group of engineers or electrical engineers. This is like occupational identity. But like you identify with the group that you belong to based on sameness, based on shared values. That's a very important thing. Based on shared history sometimes, based on shared goals. That's how you identify with a group. So after you identify a group, you have to decide whether after you categorize a group, you have to identify with it. Do I belong to this group? And mind you, those things happen sometimes unconsciously. So when I'm saying that, I don't think that you, as growing up, you decide, but this is what we do unconsciously. We categorize, we divide, we put patterns, and then we identify. After you do that, you do comparison. That the comparison is very important. One aspect of comparison, you compare your group to other groups, is related to self-esteem. Because we are a symbolic human beings. We are symbolic creatures. I'm sorry. As a symbolic creatures, we need to survive other than just meeting our physical needs. One of the most important needs is self-esteem, and we know that belonging to a group can help us feel this sense of importance and self-esteem. So one thing we do, and most of the time, is look at other groups as the outside and us as the in group versus out group. And in very rare situation, not rare situations, but many situations, we de-grade the other group just to make us feel better in terms of self-esteem. And that's also a psychological mechanism, right? We need to feel that our life has a meaning. We need to feel that it's important, our belongings, our groups, and group belonging and identification with group gives us this sense of self-esteem, without which there would be a lot of problems that we're going to talk about today, the issues of diffusion, identity diffusion, or crisis. So yeah, it's a three-step process. You categorize, and this is basically called the social identity theory. It's been since the 70s, and it's been used since then. Many research have been used and applied to it. How do we form identities, social identities, like group identities, like national identities? Categorize, identify, and then discriminate. The discriminate is very important. As I said, even cells do that. Cells discriminate between what's inside of them and what's outside of them, even at that basic level.
Right. I mean, you're talking from a psychological perspective, not from what discrimination is understood today as a social phenomena or a political term. You're talking from a psychological perspective.
Oh no, yeah, not discrimination. Discrimination as in prejudice, and discrimination as what's in group, what's out group, which is a natural tendency.
Doctor, just before we move on, I wanted to go back and see if you have any information on the evolutionary basis of group identity. I mean, humans have altruistic sensibilities, and they have developed into cooperation and coordination and forming tribes or smaller groups, which became later tribes, and that was central to the human survival. Hunting mammals, before in the last, we don't even have to go too far, but if you go back about 10,000 years ago, which is not very far in terms of evolutionary biology, 50% or more of the mammals on Earth were 200 pounds and larger. So humans had to, which are mostly extinct now, but humans were very small organisms in their environment. So it would be very hard to survive without some sort of cooperation, coordination, and group mechanisms. Did that play a part in building the group identity basis for our psychology?
Yes, and thank you. I think it's a valid question, because as I was saying earlier, social identity theory was a social psychology theory based on social psychology and research. And I can talk later about some of the studies they made or they did. But later, when evolutionary psychology has become a more important field of study, an area of study. Before, all of us agreed that there is a biological evolution, right? We are descendant of this and that, and most people agreed to that. But somehow there was a little bit of resistance to the idea that our psychology also evolved, And now we know that actually it did. Actually, a lot of anthropological research, and as you said, even till now, shows us that the in-group, out-group distinction is an important aspect of our survival. You mentioned us being very small in stature. So in order to hunt, we had to go in groups. So we could not survive by ourselves. It's very rare, that you could survive. We are a social species for a reason. One of the other things that talks about the in-group, out-group mentality is the idea that we have the longest. First of all, in terms of other species, most species you just are born and they just become independent very quickly in terms of their lifespan. We have the longest prolonged childhood. That creates a lot of pressure on us to be available to our progeny. They can't survive if we're not social. We need to protect our progeny, and they have this the longest, as I said, prolonged childhood, because not only they develop physically, they develop emotionally and culturally and socially, and to do that they need to stay within a certain environment. So the in-group and out-group mentality is I would say it's a survival mechanism, as many theorists say, allows us to allowed us actually in the past to survive, because if you can rally the troops, as they say, to think and to look positively toward their in-group, and to look at the out-group sometimes in a way that is not positive, this is how you could survive. And we know that even if you look in sports nowadays, if you like team A and you don't like team B, you always look at team B and you find all excuses to make them look bad. That's a psychological mechanism we do. We like to feel good about our groups and to not feel so good about other groups, and that's has to do with our survival. We couldn't
Right.
survive without it.
Is the default status of the evolved tendencies for group identity, is the default status that you support and you feel solidarity with your group, and there is a feeling of defensiveness against other groups or hostility? Is that, maybe that's more of an anthropological question, but is that the history? Is our history, humans, when there weren't much of them on Earth, was it still as a tribal form of society? Was it a hostile environment, or was it a peaceful environment?
Well, that's a question. I think it's beyond the psychology of the topic today, but based on my own understanding of it, and I like to believe there is this, I think, distinction in psychology, especially evolutionary psychology, and people like to pin us as human beings, whether we are more like a chimpanzee or more like the bonobo, like a
Bonobos.
yeah, bonobos. So the chimpanzee are a very warring type of species, very close to us in evolutionary history, and we share the same line with them. We actually descended from the same ancestors, but they're
We
very
share 98% of the genes too. Yeah.
if even more sometimes. Yes,
Yeah.
they're very warring. They even kill. And they're very tribal. And they always like very aggressive. The bonobo, they are more kind of like make love, not war type of people.
Yeah.
They
They're
solve their
the hippies.
problems.
They're the hippies of the apes.
There's the hippies of the apes, right? And they actually solve issues sometimes without resorting to violence. Like they're not as violent as they can be violent, but the females in the bonobo, for instance, kind of like put a break on the tendencies of the males to be more violent and aggressive. I believe that we share from both. We're not one thing. So yeah, if I said this, I'm not trying to say that our history is only history of war and aggression. We also have positive emotions. We also have the morality that we developed, and this is something probably, hopefully, for another topic. We have the morality of the positive emotions. So no, it wasn't like that. There are, it's only when you're under threat you activate this. But living in a time when there is enough resources and you don't feel threatened, it's not. Uh, we are probably more peaceful. You know better than me. There are times and cultures where people coexisted from different religions and perspectives, right? I mean, I can give an example about what one back in the Andalusia in Spain, when there was an Arabic presence there. There was a time when things were stable and peaceful, where people from different backgrounds worked together. Did philosophy. So it's not always like that.
Right. So yeah, we've spent it's just out of an interest in the scientific background of the
Yeah.
topic of group identity. But let's jump to the future and to now,
Yes.
actually, where we have developed multiple layers of identity that are getting more and more complicated as a human civilization progresses. Let's zoom in on Arab identity. So this kind of cultural or social or national identity, how does it form? What's its importance in the self-actualization of a person?
Yes. Well, again, as I said earlier, we categorize, we identify, and we discriminate, but not in a way that is negative, for self-esteem. So children, grow up into environments, right? They grow up, they don't reinvent the wheel. They grow up into a certain matrix of relationship and culture, which is the parents at the beginning. Parents themselves have their own identity and matrices, and they influence the kids. So it's inevitable that growing up you do identify with a certain cultural aspect of your family. That's how it happens. It's a natural thing, like drinking water. You grow up into a certain environment and family, and you identify with it. Religiously, culturally, nationally, whatever you want to call it. So national identity is just something that you grow up into, seeing your family, learning from your family, and you grow up into identifying with this group. It makes it easy because the group that you're identifying with has a lot in common with you, right? Culture, history, language, traditions, uh, experiences, places, arts. So those things makes you identify readily with this group, because that's what we do. We look at these groups, and unconsciously we tend to identify with groups that have similar attributes to us, and that's only natural. You identify with the group that you live with, but also that the group that shares a lot with you, linguistically, culturally, and historically. So that's what happened. There's nothing magical about it. We shouldn't. Uh, People sometimes fight it. They say, like, I'm not this or that. Well, you can say whatever you want to say about yourself, but the fact of the matter is that you grow up within a certain niche and environment, and you end up identifying with aspects of this environment. What we're going to talk about today is that how can you use this identity in a more flexible, adaptive, and more forthcoming manner. You use your identity to negotiate the world or with the world, and you use your identity to improve your sense of vitality and self and meaning. We don't want to talk about identity in a way which is a closed concept, right? Which makes you very unable to adjust and learn from others. We want to use identity, and your identification with any group identity allows you to be open to other perspectives and cultures. I'll give one example. As I said, group identification is widespread, right? If you are an electrical engineer, you identify with this type of engineers, right? Group of these engineers. Now, how strongly you identify with them, with any group, it depends on your values, right? So if you are an engineer and you're also a father, right? And there's fight at some time between your role as a father and your role as an engineer, and you might make a choice about which is important to you, and there's no judgment here. Some people would say, my career is important, my belonging to this group, and they make a value judgment, and then you can say, well, in terms of priorities at this time in their life, their career, their identification with their career with this group is important to them. But most of the time, our identification, with groups is beyond monetary values. Is more symbolic, is more related to our sense of self-esteem. And I go back to this point all the time, because lack of identification with a group, lack of a solid identity, can lead to all sort of problems. One things we have to pay attention is that as our kids, and we're talking about Arab identity now, in the community, are growing up, you want to help them, to lead them to develop an identity, to develop aspects of themselves, to interact and negotiate with the world. But if you don't provide them with ways where they can actually identify with groups, like national identity, you are creating a sense of a lack of substance, let me call it, that will have to be filled by someone else. Adolescents are very known that they are easily attracted to groups outside if they don't have any attachments. Kids, adolescents that age, they might join gangs, might join groups that are not helpful to them, because, as I said earlier, this is a natural human tendency to identify with groups. And now, when we don't give them an atmosphere where they can actually readily find symbols they can attach to and work with it, we are creating faragh, I'm sorry,
Vacuum.
vacuum, thank you, where it can be filled readily by their friends.
Right.
Adolescents need to identify, and if they don't find it, they're gonna look for it anywhere else. Sometimes they are good in it. They look into like chess clubs, or computer clubs, but unfortunately, for most of the part, they actually might end up identifying with groups that are not
Yeah,
helpful.
but even doctor, even talking about that, let's say that they, because some parents, they resort to this, and they feel that it's healthy, and it is indeed healthier than other alternatives, and it seems that it is very positive, of course. Um, when they put their children in sports clubs, in a team, basketball, soccer, whatever it is, gymnastics, ice skating, and the child gets really submerged in that group, and with continuous practice and games and performances, and becomes friends with the other performers, it becomes more of a way of life. And it is definitely a positive thing from a health perspective, from spending time in a productive way, identifying with something that is also positive. But is that enough? Is that a layer of belonging enough to, or is there actual a cultural identity that is needed, that has more depth, more relationship to the history from which that child comes, or from the tendencies of his traditions and emotions?
I think if I want to think about it myself personally, and I think uh, I'll take your example. I agree with you. Parents should do that. Should allow their kids to join sports groups, clubs, that can actually challenge them and make them feel a certain sense of belonging and a shared goal with the group that they belong to. And but sports, for instance, I think it's an offshoot of our tendency to identify with groups, in group and out group. It's very easy. Like they did this research in class. Very readily they say, you are group A, you are group B. We're going to give you two numbers, and you're going to decide whether you give this person who belongs to A certain amount of money versus certain amount of money for someone who belongs to B. And you don't know these people, but you just learn that they belong to your group. You tend on average to give someone who's assigned randomly to be in your group more money. It's not real money, but still, it's amazing how we do that. We need to identify. It's something that's within our psyche, within our brain. But also, I think the sometimes what we see in sports, I think this identification and aggression we see in sports, in certain, in the way sometimes people do it, has to do with a lack of a solid identity, with a lack of meaning that you have in other aspects of your life, that you tend to put all your eggs in the basket of your sports team.
No
You know,
offense to the English fans out there.
they're not the only ones. They're everywhere, and I think it can be a healthy thing to watch sport, to learn, to practice it, and it brings a sense of cohesion. But also think about how national identity relates to sports, because sport is like going and rooting for your national team is one of the most meaningful things people can do. You can have your own clubs, like for instance, I support Barcelona, right? They are my team, and I'm so happy when they win, right? But they're not my team, because when my team, let's just say, any Arab countries for that matter, do something special and reach the World Cup, my sense of self-esteem and pride is different. I might be happy when Barcelona win, but the sense of pride, the sense of accomplishment, and that's different. So I say it's an offshoot of our tendency to identify with groups. But if you don't have a solid sense of identification with a group that gives you, as you said, symbolic attachment, meaning, continuity with something bigger than you, then you might put everything in your team, but this is momentary, like your
Right.
team plays once a
And it
week, and
might
what do you do?
and it might work at a younger age, but at an older age, it would not be enough to fulfill some of the deep needs of a human being, and the fulfillment of it, of these tendencies. Doctor, so I want to bring a topic once that I've discussed with some friends. There is a Canadian, um, from an Egyptian background, from an Arabic background, who was playing against a UAE person. I think it was judo or so, I think it was judo or something. He is playing against a person from UAE. So he has the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So he's
Hmm.
Emirati citizenship, but he's a foreign player because, in UAE they started giving citizenship to some foreign players to strengthen their sports.
Hmm.
And so many of my friends, they found themselves happy for the winning of the Egyptian Canadian over the UAE, whatever, from, he's non-Arab. I think he's from a
Hmm.
Russian background, perhaps, or something.
Hmm.
But even if I'm saying this as an example, okay,
Hmm.
if and then when I mentioned that, some said that, is this racist to feel this way? And I didn't think that this is something that's a racist emotion. This is just a natural emotion that you tend to be, you identify with certain people for different reasons and different times. So that might vary, right, from one
Hmm.
situation to the other. If it was something, for example, the democratic countries versus non-democratic countries, I will be happier to support the democratic country because I identify more with a democratic country. But when it is, another context, we have different tendencies. Now, these tendencies, that's what I wanna bring here is these tendencies which are natural sometimes, and they don't mean to demean anyone else. You're not like, it's not a feeling of superiority or anything, but they're natural that you
Hmm.
tend to be, identify with certain people, and then you would of course vouch for them. You'd love you, their happiness, their success kind of reflects on you. What's the psychological perspective on that?
Well, I mean, if I have to think about it, and I think it's a it's a case that we're gonna have a lot, right? Especially in the way that immigration and things happening, right? And in an ideal world, right? As you said, you should. But again, the word "should" is the wrong word, because as you said, I think most people do not think about that. It's an immediate emotion, and if you think about it, I think it has to do with the identification again. You tend to identify more with people who look like you, whether we like it or not, who speak like you, who it's not something racist. And I want to make it, if you use it in a racist way, that is racist, of course, but a natural tendency to identify with people who resemble you culturally and physically and linguistically is something, as you said yourself. Yeah, it is a natural tendency. And sometimes you have to work maybe to say, oh, but his win, like is for the Qatari country, which is an Arab country, if we, I mean Emirati country, but it's a feeling, and our feelings are value judgments. They give us this feeling, and we shouldn't discount them. Sometimes we have to, suppress them, because they're not valid in certain environment, but not be hard on ourselves. I think it's an immediate reaction that we have, and I think it makes sense given what we discussed about group identity is based on sameness and shared aspects. So it's very hard, because it creates what we say in psychology. Like in America, right? Give me an example. We are more accustomed that this is a very diverse country, which is a beautiful thing, right? We have all sorts of people, all sorts of ethnicities, and the idea of an American is not one thing, right? An American can be many things, you are an American, I'm an American. There's a lot of Americans, that have different aspects and different combinations. But in some countries, like we're not used to them, like UAE, for instance, there's a dissonance in your mind, right? I mean, you're looking at this foreign player who is really maybe a nice guy, or who's just there for any reason, but in your mind maybe there's a dissonance. But like, because if he was an American player, you wouldn't have a hard time, because in America there is this diversity, there is this different translation of what is an American. But since in UAE it's not like that, it creates a dissonance in your mind where you look at this player and say, he's not. And it takes time. Maybe if UAE does this for a long time, then maybe it becomes part of our brain and we're used to it.
It will reestablish a new identity for UAE. Right now,
Exactly.
that's not part of its national identity.
Let me give you an example, Wissam. I'm sorry to interrupt. The Armenian population in Lebanon, I'm sure, they had to escape a lot of not only prejudice, but also massacre. And historically, we know what happened during the Armenian, blocking the name, the massacre or genocide, and I'm sure some people will not like what I'm saying about that. But initially, when they came to Lebanon, right, I'm sure they struggled, for instance. But now, an Armenian in Lebanon is a Lebanese. Like if he's playing, in any sports, I would feel that he is Lebanese, because they became part of our idea of what a Lebanese is. They are Lebanese, and so as you said, it updated our prototype of what is a Lebanese. In that, so in UAE, it might take time for this to reach, because, and maybe some people think about it as a more opportunistic thing, right? Like, are you giving this person a citizenship just to make sure that you win something? So in a sense, you are using this person. And I'm not saying they did that, but it becomes like, this is not fair because you are using someone else.
So yeah, so to recap on this point, we do have raw emotions that has to do with our identification, group identification, and identifying with other people. We should not really be harsh on ourselves as long as these emotions do not produce any type of judgment or action that is unjust, or that is divisive or that is negative towards any people. Um, Another question on that topic, there is a feeling sometimes that this type of what do you call it, kind of supporting your supporting what you perceive as your identity when they are a minority different from when they are a majority. So we kind of expect from people in the majority to not identify with their own sub identifications that put them in the majority. But for people who are in a minority, when they do uh, identify with these identities that make them a minority, or that is a minority, we it's kind of, it feels that it's okay. That's how it feels, and I feel like that's how we deal with it. So for example, I was attending one comedy show, and the comedian was making fun of white people
Hmm.
in a way that I felt, it was almost uncomfortable, but it was kind of acceptable in the audience, just because they are a majority. So there's kind of an expectation that they should not be uh, protected from such humor, while this humor would not be humorous at all if reflected on a minority. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, uh, I think those terms, minority and majority, have become weaponized lately, as terms. And I don't think maybe this is the right time to go into it. But I would say that, yes, of course, if you are a minority in terms of, who you are, uh, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, uh, you experience that on a daily basis. Like, for instance, if you're a majority in America, like, you speak, you know, but you and me, we speak English. We have to add this, right? We have to. Uh, I think we're aware of that. This, we speak English. We come from this place, But I think if I'm understanding you correctly, is that, what is a psychological mechanism of making jokes about people in the majority
No,
and
what I
not.
mean is, sometimes if you have, for example, China playing against another small country, let's say Nepal or something, and you have the whole audience cheering against Nepal, it feels a little bit harsh. While if the audience is cheering for Nepal, not against it, it feels a little bit more ethical. Just like, for example, identifying as Palestinian, or the Palestinian flag is raised in games, because this identity, the declaration of such an identity becomes an act of resistance because it is under oppression. So I feel that these geopolitical environments create different perspective on our narratives of identities.
That's a good point you're bringing. I think it's not one bill that fits everyone. Like, I think, for some people, given historical circumstances, then their identity is something that they have to overexpose and use, because that's the only thing that allows them to survive and keep their cause alive. What I'm worried about is that, and that's something like, like, if when I'm saying that we need to have an Arab identity, right? And I'm aware that when I'm saying that, I'm not advocating that we should not integrate other aspects of our identity, because we're talking about Arab Americans. Let's talk about them here. It would be very, I think, dangerous to say that we need to hold all these aspects of identity, and we identify with it rigidly, but then at the same time we can jump from one to another. I think what we need to realize is that identity is a negotiated thing. You negotiate it with others. I mean, they would like us to believe that identity is something that's malleable in every aspect. That's something I think is dangerous. You need to have solidity to your identity, stability to it, constancy to it. But at the same time, you need to be able to update it and allow other perspective to engage with it. So every one of us, with support from their parents, they can be exposed to aspects of their history, symbols, culture. There's nothing wrong with it. I think museums play a good role, festivals play a good role, shows, arts, music, food. But at the same time, we should be also encouraging our adolescents and youngsters to use this identity to negotiate with the world and to update it, to form something that is like an Arab American identity. I think it's a lovely term for me, because it says that I have this history, I have this connection to this culture, to this language, to the history. I have this connection to what happens to the people back at home. There's no way I'm going to be ever separate from it. I think you mentioned this once about how much even new generations, your second or third generations, sometimes when there are causes in the Arab world, they jump, and especially, let's say, Palestinian issue. So we have this, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we are identifying at this group and everyone else is outside this group. As you said earlier, while the psychology explains why we have this tendency, we have to overcome this and realize that, as you said, we live in a country that is based on melting pot, right? Culturally melting pot, but we have also to negotiate who we are and how do you bring something to the American experience. Because as I said earlier, American experience is a very diverse thing. It's not one thing, and nobody can claim that they are the American experience. We could do a disservice to ourselves if we just want to attach ourselves to one single aspect of our identity.
Yeah. Doctor, yes.
Go ahead.
As far as, because we have 5 minutes left, and I want to bring the topic of identity crisis and diffusion.
Yes.
And you, as a clinical psychologist, you face some of the results of the loss of identity or identity crisis. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that, the importance of the presence of identity in our life? We understand that there is different layers. We integrate them all. Identity is a positive force, not a negative force. What is the role of it in facing identity crisis and diffusion?
And those terms, let me just clarify them. A crisis in psychology is not something negative. It's like certain things you have to accomplish. Every stage in your life, every time you have a crisis and you deal with it. How you deal with the crisis is the most important thing. So as I said, adolescents face this bewildering array of choices, of changes in their body, in their relationship, and they have to make sense of it. That's a crisis. How they deal with it. So I'll give you an example. James Marcia, a famous psychologist, came up with a very good, matrix of 2 by 2, which I think it would be lovely to explain to anyone what's going on sometimes. And he said that on one side you have the commitment on the x-axis, or whatever you want to call it, and the other side is the crisis exploration, right? So if your crisis is low, so you're not feeling any sense of a problem, you're not even doing anything, right? And your commitment is low, this is diffusion. You have no identity, there's no urge in you. You just like, I don't know what you call it. I don't know if you've seen people like that, right? Like they're not even looking and working towards something, and they're not committed to anything. It's like they have no center of gravity, right? We call it diffusion. They're like stagnant in life. You got also people who have high crisis, that are working hard, and tackling with the question of who they are, what they want to be, their identity, but yet they are not committed to anything yet. It's called moratorium. When they put moratorium on, people are hearing this word lately a lot about the moratorium and related to housing market. It's just putting a break. It's mainly, like, it's a good thing because you are right now. Oh, you found it, right?
Yes, you can speak while I show this to the audience.
Yeah. So I'm saying the identity diffusion, if you leave it there, is related to you're not experiencing any crisis and you're not even committed to anything in your life, identity-wise, whether nationally, whether occupationally. Now we go to the moratorium that I mentioned, is that you have no commitment, but you are struggling. You are in the process, like someone goes to school and they are trying to figure out what field they want to be in, right? But they haven't committed to anything yet. This is called moratorium. Now you have people who come to you and they have no identity crisis, yet they have committed. So that's kind of like foreclosure. There is nothing else to do. And that's what parents sometimes push kids to do, right? You're a doctor, so you start talking to them like, oh, you are also a doctor, or you're going to be a musician, or you're going to be like daddy, a football player, or like mommy, whatever. And they grow up, not having a crisis, but they already committed. This is called foreclosure because you already foreclosed on any other possibility for them to explore other identities and aspects. The best thing, if you can go back to it, which is identity achievement, happens when you have a lot of struggle with it, questioning things in your life, trying to figure out who you are, where do you belong, what makes you who you are, and you reach a commitment to something, right? Because the worst thing you could do is that you commit to something that you haven't struggled with, right? And that's what I might say it. That's why religious commitment sometimes is like that, because most people do not go through the crisis. You just commit to it. So it's like you're foreclosed in yourself, other aspects of exploration. Mm-hmm. And when these people who commit at an early age because of their parents' pressure, they grow up sometimes and then they realize that they haven't done that work. So they struggle with the crisis in a positive manner. And they say, wait a minute, I foreclosed on my identity, but I haven't done the work. I only did it because I've been told so, or I've been pushed to do that. So right. Those are four aspects.
Just to add, sometimes that religiosity comes after an identity crisis, and it becomes a strong commitment to find it a stronger commitment. Yeah,
I've seen it, and I'm saying having a religiosity that comes because of a strong crisis and a strong commitment is much better than having it because you have foreclosed on other aspects. Like you're born into it and you do it, especially when it comes to this question. So identities that are really solid are the ones that you negotiate with the world. Of course, you're not gonna wake up and say I'm a rabbit. I mean, yeah, we can entertain you a little bit, but if it becomes a problem, you're heading out to psychiatric hospital. There are limits, and that's what people forget, that identities are limited also by society and by us, by you. So this negotiation, you enter this negotiation. A 2-year-old can say whatever they want to say, and we let them. They're exploring, they're playing, But sometimes, as a society, we come to it, right? And we say, now you have to negotiate with the world. And negotiating with the world is part of the crisis, and you reach a commitment, and that's a solid identity. That's what I think in therapy, you do that by exploring the narrative you have about yourself. Believe me, many times you ask someone, tell me more about yourself. Who are you as a person? And a lot of people struggle with this question. They have no idea. They haven't done the work. So your work as a therapist is to help them form this narrative about themselves, and maybe in the process they discover that, why do I identify such and such? Why I am like that? But I haven't given it thought. You need to be careful because, as I said, you don't want to destabilize people. You need to make sure that they're doing it in an incremental manner. But therapy helps you create your narrative. We are a narrative creature. We love stories. If anything, we love stories. We love beginnings and endings. We don't like things to be, and it is what it is. We have the Big Bang, and right, and we talk about eventually going to the big crunch, if I'm correct. In reality, people say that is more cyclical. There is no beginning and end, but our brain can only work through discrete periods, beginning and end. So the stories we tell ourselves are our identity. The stories we tell people are part of our identity. If a person is not able to do that, then there's an issue. Psychologically, there is an issue. And the first thing, a red flag in my mind, well, they're struggling with a sense of identity.
Yes.
You cannot cope with the world with issues if you don't know who you are and you don't have a sense of a stable identity. As you said yourself, you could be religious, but if you do it based on exploration and commitment, it's more adaptive than you're religious, but you haven't struggled with the question.
Right. Doctor, I know that it is, we're already a few minutes beyond the program, but I just wanted to ask you a final question, if you allow me. So
Sure.
with our Arab American youth, me as a parent and us as a community, and perhaps this problem is also in the Arab world, we find our children growing in a very globalized world. They are consuming and ingesting data and information, and share and scenes of cultures from all over the world on a daily basis, in bits and pieces, in few seconds, bits and pieces. So the amount of variety and the amount of exposure is very high. And we find it very difficult for them to actually stabilize their understanding of identity. I mean, I don't mean that in a verbalized way, of course, in an unconscious way, just them realizing who they are, being comfortable with it, and growing up with it. Is that normal? Is that going to be just part of their crisis and growth, or is it actually a dangerous thing?
That's a question that I think these new technologies are new, social
Media.
sites and technology and phones, and I agree with you that we are still studying the impact of this on our kids and our kids' attention span, and our own attention span, and our own relation to things around us. I don't like to think of, is it going to be positive or negative, right? I think it's something that I hope that we come to a point where we find a way that we could use these things in a more adaptive manner, but I feel like at this rate we are not. At this rate, I sense more danger. Although I don't like to that, I sense more danger to our relationships, to our commitments, and to our experience of who we are, right? One thing we have to know is that adolescents and young kids, and adolescents in the West, maybe in some countries, they don't have this period, which is a prolonged childhood. At 12, 13, your childhood is over. You go into adulthood in some cultures. So adolescence is a fairly new period, that allowed us to realize that children cannot just go from being a child to an adult. They have to go through a period of learning more about the world, teaching them how to be responsible, expecting more from them, but at the same time realizing that they still need support. You asked me earlier about science. We know science now tells us that the prefrontal cortex, which is the most important aspect of human beings, what distinguishes us as human beings, that relates to inhibition, planning, rational decision making, it continues to develop well into 20s. So I believe that even in 10, 15 years, we're going to start redefining what's an adult. As someone who is 19 or 18, legally an adult can make decisions, but we know that from science that their brain is not yet complete, especially the prefrontal cortex. I'm saying that because those areas of social networks and social sites, if you don't have a solid identity and you go there as an adolescent and you are exposed on a daily basis with content from these places, that's dangerous because you don't know what to make of it. Remember, we said identity allows you to negotiate with the world, allows you to look at things from a meaning, value perspective, and deal with it. If you don't have that, you are creating this, as you said yourself, this bombarding of information that you don't very quickly that you can make sense of it, and that creates a problem where one problem I can see is narcissism. We're becoming they studied this and they're saying narcissism among users, because we are working with kids who are interested in the here and now, how many likes I get, who loves me, and we're creating a lot of problems. I think it's beyond the topic of today. What I would like to say is that we could do things as parents, a lot of parents can do that. It's not, I think it should be something that we think of as possibly we could make some breaks and apply breaks in this area. Parents have to be more involved with their kids, limiting their time on these devices and these sites, making sure that they are not alone or they're knowing what they're doing, while affording opportunities for the kids to meet other kids their age, kids that belong maybe to their group identities, like as we said, culturally speaking, gatherings that have food related to our culture and our heritage. In South Africa, of apartheid, and the identity of the majority at that time was being abolished, like trying to be completely erased. Now they do something which is very intentional, symbols, cultural symbols, and take their kids to teach them about these symbols, cultural symbols. So museums in our culture, schools can do that, can take kids to these museums, introduce them, So as parents, we have a lot of work to do by being mindful of our kids' consumption of these technologies, but also by arranging opportunities for them where they can actually get involved with these aspects of our history. Again, not in a closed manner, in an open-minded manner, not in a manner where this is our identity, everyone else is wrong and bad and evil. No, this is our identity that we're going to use to negotiate with the world, but it gets updated. So we can do that, and I think we need another episode to talk about what can we do to revitalize the sense of Arab identity, Arab American identity, in a sense, in this country. Maybe you said Arab identity because your show goes more than America, but I think if we focus also Arab American identity, the need to be able to negotiate and to be flexible, and because if there is any country that allows you to do that, I believe it's the United States. Compared to other countries, you have the freedom to negotiate a sense of identity. You don't have to completely separate from who you are. You
Right.
still can feel that connection, but also there is a lot of things, as you said yourself, you have a lot of definitions. You identify with democratic countries, with scientific communities. This country allows us to do that, and we need to give our kids the space to explore all of that.
Thank you, Dr. Adnan Jaber, and thank you for our audience for watching with us. Please share this episode with others who you feel will benefit from it. We definitely will be talking a little bit more from the past by arranging for an episode with an anthropologian. And also, we are going to prepare another episode, like you advised, Doctor, about vitalizing Arab identity, what parents can do to revitalize Arab identity in their children. Thank you again. Stay with us in the upcoming episodes of Arab identity, and have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good night.